Some wounds don't bleed, yet they hurt more than anything else. They live quietly inside us, hidden behind smiles, routines, and silence. Gabriel Rolón once said there are things that cannot be forgiven, and when you truly understand that, it changes the way you see love, pain, and yourself. There are moments in life when someone crosses a line that was never meant to be crossed. Not with violence, not with shouting, but with absence. With betrayal. With words that arrive too late, or actions that never arrive at all. And people will tell you, you must forgive to move on. But they rarely ask what it costs you to forgive something that shattered who you were. Because not everything that hurts can be repaired with an apology. Some damage doesn't come from a mistake, but from a choice. From knowing exactly what you were doing and doing it anyway. From looking at someone who trusted you and deciding they were disposable. The hardest truth is this: forgiving everything can sometimes mean betraying yourself. There are things that cannot be forgiven because forgiving them would require you to deny your own pain. It would mean pretending that what broke you wasn't real. And pain ignored doesn't disappear, it just changes shape. It turns into silence, into distance, into a version of you that no longer feels safe to love deeply. Sometimes what hurts the most is not what was done, but what was never acknowledged. The lack of responsibility. The refusal to say, yes, I hurt you. Because without that, forgiveness becomes a burden placed only on the one who suffered. And that is not healing, that is injustice dressed as maturity. Let's be honest. There are betrayals that don't end relationships, they end innocence. They end the belief that love is always safe. They end the version of you who trusted without fear. And once that is gone, no apology can bring it back. And still, people stay. They stay out of fear, out of habit, out of hope that maybe one day things will feel the same again. But deep inside, something has already closed. Not with anger, but with exhaustion. Because carrying pain while pretending everything is fine is one of the most tiring things a human being can do. Not forgiving doesn't always mean hating. Sometimes it simply means choosing distance. Choosing self-respect. Choosing not to reopen a wound just to prove you are strong enough to survive it again. There are things that cannot be forgiven because they teach you a lesson you cannot unlearn. That not everyone who says they love you knows how to care for you. That not everyone who stays deserves a place in your heart. And that love, without respect, is not love, it is damage. Healing does not always come from reconciliation. Sometimes it comes from accepting that what happened changed everything, and that it's okay to grieve what could have been. It's okay to say, this hurt too much, and I choose myself now. Because forgiveness is not an obligation. It is a choice. And choosing not to forgive can be an act of deep self-love when it protects you from being broken again. In the end, the goal is not to become cold, but to become honest with yourself. To recognize that your pain matters. That your limits matter. And that there are things in life that don't need to be forgiven to be released. Some things don't deserve forgiveness. They deserve understanding, acceptance, and a quiet goodbye. There comes a moment when pain stops asking for answers and starts demanding truth. A quiet moment, usually at night, when the noise of the world fades and you are left alone with what still hurts. That is when you realize that not everything broken can be fixed, and not everything lost should be recovered. Some wounds do not want revenge, explanations, or even apologies. They want honesty. People often talk about forgiveness as if it were a moral obligation, a sign of spiritual superiority, a shortcut to peace. But they rarely talk about the other side of forgiveness, the part where you have to look at yourself and ask whether forgiving means healing, or whether it means abandoning yourself once again. Because there are pains that did not come from ignorance or error, but from deliberate choices. And those choices leave marks that do not fade just because time passes. What hurts the most is not always the act itself, but the realization that someone knew what they were doing. They knew your story, your fears, your limits, and still crossed the line. That kind of pain doesn't scream. It settles. It changes the way you listen, the way you trust, the way you love. It teaches you to measure your words, to hide your vulnerability, to protect what once was freely given. Forgiving something like that is not simple. Because to forgive, you would need to pretend that the pain did not change you. That it didn't cost you sleepless nights, anxiety, self-doubt. And when forgiveness demands silence about your suffering, it becomes another form of violence, quiet, socially accepted, but deeply damaging. Sometimes people stay in relationships where forgiveness has been forced, not because the pain disappeared, but because they were taught that leaving means failure. They stay hoping that love will somehow erase memory. But memory doesn't disappear, it waits. And it resurfaces in moments of tension, in sudden distance, in the inability to feel safe again. There are betrayals that don't end relationships immediately. They linger. They poison slowly. They turn affection into caution, closeness into calculation. And one day you realize that you are no longer angry, just tired. Tired of pretending. Tired of explaining. Tired of carrying something that was never yours to carry alone. Not forgiving doesn't always come from bitterness. Sometimes it comes from clarity. From understanding that protecting yourself is not selfish. That choosing distance can be healthier than forcing closeness. That love without respect becomes a place where you slowly disappear. There is a deep sadness in realizing that someone you loved could hurt you in a way that cannot be undone. Not because they were evil, but because they were careless with something sacred, your trust. And trust, once broken, does not return to its original form. It may rebuild, but it is never the same structure. It carries cracks, reminders, limits. Healing begins when you stop negotiating with your pain. When you stop asking yourself if you should have endured more, forgiven faster, loved harder. Healing begins when you accept that what hurt you mattered. That your experience is valid, even if others don't understand it. Some people confuse forgiveness with forgetting. But forgetting is impossible when pain has taught you something important. It taught you where your boundaries are. It taught you what you will no longer accept. It taught you that love is not proven by endurance, but by care. There are things that cannot be forgiven because they ended a version of you that no longer exists. The innocent version. The one that trusted without fear. And mourning that loss is part of healing. You don't have to rush it. You don't have to justify it. You don't have to turn it into a lesson for others. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is say, "This hurt too much, and I choose to stop here." Not with hatred. Not with drama. Just with dignity. A quiet goodbye that protects what remains of you. Forgiveness is meaningful only when it is free. When it comes from understanding, not pressure. From choice, not obligation. And when it doesn't, it becomes another burden placed on the wounded. In the end, healing is not about becoming cold or distant. It is about becoming honest. Honest with your limits. Honest with your pain. Honest with what you deserve. Some things do not need forgiveness to be released. They need acceptance, self-respect, and the courage to move forward without looking back. Because letting go is not always about forgiving others. Sometimes it is about finally choosing yourself.